The famous portrait of Queen Victoria hanging in London's National Portrait Gallery shows power, dignity, and moral authority. She stands wrapped in royal silk, holding the symbols of empire. To the world, she represented order, civilization, and progress. An empire that believed it was spreading light across the globe. But if we move away from the painting and look instead at Britain's financial records in the late 1830s, a very different picture appears. Behind the polished image of Victorian morality was an empire struggling to survive, and willing to cross any moral line to do so. By the early 19th century, the British Empire was quietly running the largest state-backed drug operation the world had ever seen. This story is rarely told in Western classrooms or historical dramas. British warships destroying Chinese cities, not to defend freedom, but to protect drug smugglers, is an uncomfortable truth. For Britain, it is often described as a mistake or miscalculation. For China, it was a national catastrophe. To understand how this happened, we need to understand one thing: tea. By the 1800s, tea was not just a drink in Britain. It was essential. Factory workers depended on it to survive long shifts. The upper classes turned it into a ritual. And the British government depended on tea taxes to fund its navy and bureaucracy. But there was a problem. Tea only came from China. The Qing Emperor had no interest in British goods. He rejected British wool, machinery, and technology. The only thing China accepted in exchange for tea was silver. Year after year, British ships sailed east filled with silver and returned with tea. Britain's wealth was draining away. The trade imbalance threatened the entire imperial economy. The East India Company needed a solution, something China would buy no matter the cost. They chose opium. In British-controlled India, especially Bengal, the colonial administration took control of opium production. Farmers were forced to replace food crops with poppy fields. Large factories processed the drug under government supervision. Opium was measured, standardized, stamped, and treated like an official state product. But opium was illegal in China. So Britain created distance between the government and the crime. The opium was auctioned to private traders in India. These traders, men like William Jardine, shipped the drug to the Chinese coast. Floating warehouses stored the opium offshore. Local officials were bribed. Smuggling networks spread it inland. And silver began flowing back to Britain. By the late 1830s, millions in China were addicted. Soldiers sold weapons to buy opium. Officials failed their duties. Entire communities collapsed. China's economy began to weaken as silver drained out of the country. The Qing Emperor realized the state itself was at risk. In 1839, he appointed an honest and determined official named Lin Zexu to stop the trade. Lin launched a massive crackdown. Dealers were arrested. Addicts were forced into treatment. Then he targeted the foreign smugglers. British merchants in Canton were surrounded. Supplies were cut off. Under pressure, the British superintendent ordered the surrender of all opium stocks, promising merchants they would be compensated by their government. Lin Zexu seized over 20,000 chests of opium. Instead of selling it, he destroyed it publicly, mixing it with lime and seawater and dumping it into the ocean. He also wrote a letter to Queen Victoria. He asked a simple moral question. If opium was illegal in Britain, how could Britain justify poisoning another nation? The letter was never answered. In London, the destruction of the opium was not seen as justice. It was seen as theft. British traders demanded compensation. The government, already desperate for revenue, sided with them. War was chosen. In 1840, British warships, powered by steam and iron, arrived on China's coast. The Chinese Navy, still made of wooden ships, stood no chance. Ports were bombarded. Trade routes were cut. Cities were threatened. By 1842, British guns were aimed at Nanjing. China surrendered. The Treaty of Nanjing forced China to pay massive reparations, including payment for the destroyed opium. Several ports were opened to foreign control, and one small island was handed over to Britain. That island was Hong Kong. Under British protection, the opium trade expanded even further. Revenue from the drug-funded railways, administration, and military power across the empire. Britain's global dominance was built, in part, on addiction. For China, the Opium War marked the beginning of what is remembered as the Century of Humiliation, a period of invasion, instability, and loss of sovereignty. The men who profited from the trade were rewarded. Many became politicians and wealthy elites. Their companies evolved into major financial institutions that still exist today. Eventually, Britain ended the opium trade, not because of sudden morality, but because it no longer needed it. The legacy remains. The story of the Opium Wars shows how easily power can turn commerce into exploitation, and how empires often hide their darkest foundations behind symbols of progress. This is not just history. It is a warning. Because once a nation is poisoned by force, trust is almost impossible to restore.